All right, so let's get into it today. Dearborn, Michigan.
Oh, yeah.
Huge Arab American community, and we're just a couple weeks out from the election.
Yeah.
And, historically,
Right.
they've leaned Democrat, but this year,
Yeah.
it's different.
It's a different story this year. This is a community that's really struggling with their faith in the system right now. I mean, they're looking around and they don't feel like their voice matters, and they don't feel like either candidate is truly representing them. And it's
Yeah, and you can't talk about this without talking about what's happening in Gaza and Lebanon.
yeah,
We're seeing these images of suffering,
absolutely.
and it's just hitting home so hard in Dearborn.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Like, you're seeing funerals in Dearborn for people who were killed in Lebanon. Families here are struggling to even get in touch with their loved ones who are trapped in these conflict zones. This is not some distant war for them. It's a reality that's deeply personal.
The article talks about Dearborn's mayor, Abdullah Hammoud, saying his own family can't even go to a funeral in Lebanon because it's too dangerous. It's
Okay.
that direct.
Yeah, and that's where that dilemma comes in, right? Because you have so many Arab Americans in Dearborn who feel so connected to their ancestral homeland, and they feel a sense of responsibility to those who are suffering in Gaza and Lebanon.
Right.
But then at the same time, the idea of voting for a candidate who they see as supporting Israel, even indirectly, feels like a betrayal almost.
Yeah.
Like they're complicit in that violence.
So then you have Trump and, his history with the Muslim community
Not great.
has not been great. We have the travel bans and the rhetoric.
And it's still fresh in people's minds. Like,
Right.
that stuff really left its mark. But it's interesting because even with all of that, there are people in this community who are so disillusioned with the current situation that they're considering overlooking that history and voting for him again.
Wow. And then you have Kamala Harris.
Right.
And there are people who think that she might be potentially more sympathetic to the Palestinian experience.
Yeah.
But she's also tied to the Biden administration's policies, which have not exactly made her a hero in Dearborn.
Yeah. I mean, she's walking a tightrope, right? She's
No.
trying to appeal to Arab American voters without contradicting the administration's stance on Israel.
Right.
But there is this kind of quiet buzz that's out there. Like, there are sources saying she might actually take a different approach on Israel if she becomes president.
Oh, really?
But she can't say that out loud right now.
Of course not.
It's all behind the scenes whispers and speculation.
So, but here's where it gets really interesting. We know Michigan's a swing state,
Huge.
and these elections are so tight.
Absolutely.
These Arab American votes could actually decide the election.
I mean, it's a massive responsibility, and it's putting people in a really difficult position. They're having to think strategically, is this a protest vote, or is this an opportunity to actually try to influence policy? And that's a lot of weight for anyone to carry.
So how is this all playing out in Dearborn?
Well, it seems like the community is pretty divided.
Yeah.
The article talks about people who are endorsing Harris despite the backlash.
Wow.
Others who are just refusing to vote for either candidate. Okay.
And then some who are, despite everything, kind of being swayed by Trump's outreach.
Wow. So the article highlights some specific voices that are really powerful. You have this imam who endorsed Harris,
Right.
but he's facing a lot of criticism for that.
Yeah, he's getting a lot of heat for that decision.
You also have these residents who are just desperately looking for some sign that Harris might change course on Israel.
If she wins. Yeah.
And then there's Mayor Hamad talking about how he's so personally connected to the suffering.
Yeah, his words are really powerful.
And then there was this whole uncommitted movement during the primaries. What was that all about?
Oh, yeah, that was fascinating. It was this group of voters, mostly Arab American, who decided not to pledge their support to any candidate in the primaries. It was a form of protest. They were saying that neither party really represented them, and they saw it as a really powerful statement. They weren't going to be boxed in by the two-party system.
So do you think we'll see something similar happen in the general election? I mean, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about a community that's being asked to make these incredibly difficult choices. Do they vote for the lesser of two evils? Do they stay home and protest? Or do they try to find some other way to make their voices heard? It's a situation that's just loaded with emotional weight and moral dilemmas and strategic calculations. It's not an easy decision for anyone to make.
Okay, so let's talk about these conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon, because we know the headlines. But what exactly happened that led to this level of devastation?
Well, I mean, the situation in Gaza is just dire following those Hamas attacks back in October.
Right.
Israel launched this military campaign, and it's turned into a full-blown humanitarian catastrophe.
Wow.
The Gaza Health Ministry is reporting over 42,000 Palestinians killed, and the infrastructure is just decimated.
And then the conflict spilled over into Lebanon with Israel targeting Hezbollah, and the civilian casualties are climbing there too.
Yeah, it's just heartbreaking all around. The article talks about residents in Dearborn holding funerals for family members who were killed in Lebanon.
Yeah,
Even the mayor's wife can't travel to her own grandmother's funeral because of the violence.
it's just awful.
I mean, these aren't just statistics. These are real people, real families being torn apart. And for Arab Americans in Dearborn, many of whom have direct ties to these regions, it's like watching their ancestral homeland crumble before their eyes.
It's so personal.
Exactly. It's not just a news story. It's a deeply personal tragedy that's unfolding in their own families. It's watching their history, their culture, their very identity being threatened, and it's forcing them to confront some really difficult questions about their own role in all of this and how they can use their voices and their votes to make a difference.
So how are these conflicts specifically shaping the views of Arab Americans in Dearborn? What are they saying?
I think the biggest thing that comes across in the article is this deep sense of frustration with both candidates.
Mhm.
They don't feel like either one is really acknowledging the extent of their pain or the complexity of the situation.
It's like they're not being heard.
Exactly. It's like they're shouting into a void and they're not getting any response.
So is that frustration, is it directed more at one candidate than the other? Because it seems like neither one is really hitting the mark with a lot of these voters.
It's interesting because the article highlights a particular sense of disappointment with Harris. There's this feeling that she might be more sensitive to the Palestinian perspective, but she's still bound by the administration's policies.
Right. And she can't exactly come out and say, I'll do things differently when she's still the vice president. But are there any clues? Are there any hints that she might take a different approach if she becomes president?
There have been some subtle signals. Apparently, some of her allies have been quietly suggesting that she might take a more skeptical stance towards Israel if she wins. They're hinting that she might be more willing to use existing laws to limit aid to Israel under certain conditions, but it's all very hush-hush, behind the scenes.
So is this just wishful thinking on the part of her supporters? Or is there any real substance to these claims?
It's hard to say for sure. The article quotes one of her allies who claims to have zero doubt that she'll be different from Biden on Israel. But of course, this person is speaking anonymously, so take it with a grain of salt.
So it's a gamble. Then there's this possibility of change. But there's also a lot of uncertainty.
Right. It's that classic political dilemma. Do you vote for the candidate who offers a glimmer of hope for change, or do you hold on to your principles and refuse to support a system that you feel is fundamentally flawed? And when you add in the fact that their vote could actually swing the election, I mean, the pressure is immense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a lot to weigh. Okay, let's pause there for now. When we come back, I want to dive deeper into how all of this is impacting the relationship between the Arab American community and the two major political parties.
It's so easy to get lost in all the election stuff, the polls, the strategies.
Right.
But we can't forget about the real human cost of this conflict. These aren't just numbers on a screen. We're talking about real people whose lives have been shattered.
The article talks about Kamel Ahmad Jawad, a Dearborn resident who was killed in Lebanon.
Oh, gosh.
He was trying to help families who had been displaced by the violence.
That's awful.
It just shows you how this conflict is hitting home in such a real and painful way.
And then you have that whole controversy over the Biden administration initially misidentifying him as a non-citizen.
Right.
It just speaks to this feeling of being unseen and unheard and misunderstood that so many Arab Americans experience.
It really feeds into that sense of not belonging,
Yeah.
being treated as other, even though they're American citizens.
Yeah.
They're grieving, they're scared for their loved ones, and they're looking to their leaders for support and understanding, but they're not finding it.
And it's a stark example of how complex identity politics are in America. You can be fully American and still deeply connected to your ancestral homeland.
Right.
And sometimes those two identities feel like they're at odds with each other.
Especially when those homelands are caught in these conflicts.
Exactly. It's like they're being forced to choose between being American and their heritage, and that's a choice no one should have to make.
So it brings us back to that central question facing Arab American voters in Dearborn. How do they navigate this incredibly difficult political landscape?
Right. How do they make their voices heard when they feel like neither candidate really represents them?
Do they vote for the candidate they see as less harmful, even if they don't agree with everything they stand for?
Yeah.
Do they stay home and protest? Or do they try to find a third option, some way to break free from this two-party system that feels so limiting?
In 2016, some Arab American voters in Michigan voted for Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate.
Oh, that's right.
It was their way of rejecting both the Democratic and Republican candidates, a way of saying neither of you represents me.
And she's running again this year
She is.
with a strong anti-war platform, which might really resonate with voters who are disillusioned with the two main parties.
It's true, but she's not doing very well in the polls. So she might represent a symbolic protest vote, but she's unlikely to have a real impact on the outcome of the election.
But she is a sign of that growing dissatisfaction with the status quo, this feeling that the two-party system just isn't working for a lot of people.
And it's not just Arab Americans who feel this way.
Right.
We're seeing this across the political spectrum. People are feeling like the two-party system isn't addressing their needs or their concerns, and they're looking for alternatives for new ways to engage in the political process.
So where does that leave the Arab American community in Dearborn? What are their options and what are the potential consequences of their choices?
It's a tough question, and there aren't any easy answers.
Right.
But I think it's important to remember that they're not alone in this struggle. So many communities across America are facing similar challenges, trying to figure out how to make their voices heard in a system that often feels deaf to their concerns.
It's a struggle that resonates with all of us, no matter what our background is or our political affiliations.
Yep.
Because at its heart, it's about searching for a more inclusive and representative democracy, one that reflects the diversity of experiences and perspectives of all Americans.
You're hitting on something really important here. This isn't just about one community or one election.
Right.
It's about the fundamental principles of democracy. It's about ensuring that every citizen feels like they have a voice, that their vote matters.
It's about understanding that our destinies are intertwined, that what happens to one community impacts us all.
Exactly. And this is something that the people of Dearborn are grappling with every single day as they navigate these incredibly complex issues of identity and belonging. And their story holds lessons for all of us as we try to build a more just and equitable society.
We've been talking a lot about the present, but I think it's important to look back a little bit too. How did we get here? What's the history of Arab American political engagement in Michigan?
Yeah, context is crucial. To understand what's happening in Dearborn today, we need to understand how we got here. What challenges have Arab Americans faced? What victories have they achieved? And how has their relationship with the two major political parties evolved?
Have they always been more Democrat, or has that changed in recent years?
Yeah, let's delve into that history and see what insights we can find.
Okay.
So Arab Americans have deep roots in Michigan going all the way back to the late 19th century.
Wow.
They came here looking for opportunity, fleeing persecution, and building new lives. And from the very beginning, they understood that they needed to make their voices heard to participate in the American political system.
The article mentions these early Arab American social and political clubs that emerged.
Right.
It sounds like they were really important for the community. What was their purpose?
These clubs were more than just places to hang out. They were safe spaces for immigrants to talk about their concerns, to advocate for their rights, and to support each other.
Yeah.
They were crucial in helping Arab Americans integrate into American society while also preserving their cultural heritage.
It's a familiar story for so many immigrant communities, isn't it? That balance between assimilating and holding on to your tradition.
Absolutely. And these clubs were also where future leaders were born. A lot of the Arab American politicians we see today got their start in those local clubs. They learned about grassroots organizing, community building, and political advocacy.
It's a classic story of immigrant upward mobility, using the tools of democracy to gain a foothold in a new society.
It is.
It's inspiring to see how they carved out a space for themselves and made their voices heard.
Absolutely. But we also have to acknowledge that it hasn't been easy.
Of course not.
Arab Americans have faced discrimination, prejudice, and even violence throughout their history in America.
Right.
And those experiences have shaped their political views and their relationship with the two main political parties.
Right. You're right to point that out. We can't forget that history of struggle.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that for much of the 20th century, Arab Americans were often seen with suspicion and distrust, especially when there were tensions in the Middle East.
Exactly. We have to remember that historical context to understand the political dynamics at play in Dearborn today. We have to acknowledge that legacy of discrimination. Those experiences that have left a lasting impact on the community's sense of belonging and how they see the American political landscape.
So against that backdrop, How has the relationship between Arab Americans and the two major political parties evolved?
Well, for a long time, Arab Americans have generally leaned towards the Democratic Party.
Okay.
They were drawn to the party's messages of social justice, economic opportunity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
But it hasn't always been a smooth or easy relationship.
Right. There have been bumps in the road.
There have been moments when they felt let down by the Democrats, especially when it came to foreign policy in the Middle East.
Right.
And those moments of disillusionment led some to question their loyalty to the party and to look for other political options. And that's what we're seeing play out right now in Dearborn.
Okay.
These conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon have reignited those tensions.
Yeah.
And it's forcing a lot of Arab Americans to really examine where they stand politically.
So they're struggling with whether the Democratic Party really represents their values and their interests, whether they can support a party that they see as being complicit in the suffering of their people.
It's a deeply personal and challenging dilemma, and it's causing some to consider other options like not voting at all or supporting a third-party candidate or even switching to the Republicans.
It's a fascinating and complex moment in Arab American political history,
It
a
is.
story that's still being written with no clear ending in sight.
Absolutely. And it's a story that has implications far beyond Dearborn. It speaks to the broader challenges of identity politics, the evolving role of minority groups in American democracy, and the ongoing struggle to create a more just and inclusive society.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The personal stories, the moral dilemmas, the historical context.
Right.
But before we go any further, let's shift our focus to the specifics of this election and the candidates themselves.
That's a great idea. Let's break down where they stand on the issues that matter most to this community and see how their platforms resonate with the concerns of Arab American voters. Where should we start?
So we've talked about the candidates' records and how this whole situation in the Middle East is weighing on Arab American voters. But let's actually hear from some people in Dearborn. What are they saying as we head into Election Day?
Yeah, the article introduces us to this guy, Jafar Mothafar. He's young, he's always voted, but this time he's not so sure. He says the violence in Gaza and Lebanon has really shaken him, and he's just looking for any sign that Harris might break from Biden's policies on Israel.
It sounds like he's really holding on to that hope that maybe things could be different.
He is, and he's not the only one. A lot of people in the community are looking for a leader who really gets it.
Yeah.
Who understands their pain and sees how complicated this all is and can offer a path towards a real lasting peace.
Well, we talked about Mayor Hamba, but his words in this article are just so powerful. He talks about feeling this personal connection to the suffering, how these conflicts are ripping families apart and forcing people to make these impossible choices.
I know his words are really something. They remind us that this isn't just some abstract policy debate.
Right.
We're talking about real lives, families in Dearborn who are directly impacted by this violence overseas. It makes this election feel even more important.
And he makes another point that I thought was really interesting. He says that for some Arab American voters, choosing either candidate feels like choosing a side in a conflict they want nothing to do with.
Yeah.
Like they're being forced to be complicit in the suffering no matter what they do.
It's a terrible position to be in, that feeling of powerlessness, that no matter who you vote for, the outcome will be the same. It can really make people feel hopeless and apathetic, and that's dangerous for any democracy.
So how do we even begin to address that? How do the
Like-
candidates, how do we as a country reach out to a community that feels so alienated from the political process, that feels like neither party really gets them?
It's tough, but I think it starts with listening, really listening to the concerns of Arab American voters, acknowledging their pain and understanding that their experiences are valid and deserve to be taken seriously.
It's got to be more than just talk, though, right?
Oh, absolutely. It has to be about action. The candidates need to put forward policies that actually address the root causes of the conflict in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Policies that promote peace and justice and protect civilians. They need to show the Arab American community that their voices matter, that their votes can make a difference in creating a more just and equitable world.
We need to move past the fear and division that we hear so much of in politics and offer a vision of America's role in the world that's based on compassion and understanding and a real commitment to human rights.
It's a tall order, but it's what we need to do if we want to build a society where everyone feels like they belong, where everyone's voice is heard and respected, and where everyone has a chance to thrive.
So here we are just a couple weeks away from the election, and the tension is just palpable. Arab American voters in Dearborn are facing this incredibly difficult choice,
Yeah.
wrestling with their conscience, their values, and their hopes for the future.
It's a decision that will have a ripple effect, not just on the outcome of the election, but on their community and their relationship with the American political system. How they choose to engage or not engage with the process will have a lasting impact.
It's important to remember that this struggle reflects a larger struggle we're all facing to create a more inclusive and responsive democracy. It's not just about Dearborn, it's about America.
That's right. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together, that creating a just and equitable society benefits everyone. And that starts with understanding and valuing the experiences of those who have been marginalized and silenced. Their voices matter, their stories matter, and their votes matter. This election and the choices we make as a nation in the years to come will determine what kind of future we build together. We can't just sit back and watch. We all have a role to play.